Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. The Ukraine War News Update, third part thereof for the 13th of September 2024. This is a geopolitical video concerning the geopolitical context of the war in Ukraine and everything affecting it or being affected by it. Okay. We're going to start with Keir Starmer travelling to the US to meet with President Biden. Prime Minister Starmer has said that, he said a few pretty key things today, but there's a lot of talk to do with Storm Shadow missiles and the extended range capabilities of the Ukrainians in terms of firing Western weapons into Russia. Starmer tells Putin, says The Guardian, that Russia started the war with Ukraine and can end it at any time. This is really good. It's really good to see prominent Western leaders that we have seen, a number of times, but it needs to be repeated. That, hey, do you know what? This war can be ended. It can be ended really easily, and it's down to you, Putin, and you getting your troops the hell out of Ukraine. So UK Prime Minister responds to Putin's threat that use of long-range British missiles inside Russia would put it at war with NATO. Now, I read you out what Putin said by reading his subtitles, or the subtitles to his response to this. Putin is calling the West bluff, and it's good to see some, hopefully it remains this way, some strong rhetoric from Starmer here. Keir Starmer has told Vladimir Putin that he started the war in Ukraine and could end it at any time after the Russian leader warned that any use of long-range British missiles into Russian territory would put NATO at war with his country. Prime Minister spoke en route to Washington to see US President Joe Biden as he sought to justify a Western decision made behind closed doors that would allow Ukraine to attack inside Russia with partly British-made Storm Shadows. Responding directly to threats earlier by the Russian president, Starmer told reporters Russia started this conflict. Russia illegally invaded Ukraine. Russia can end this conflict straight away. Ukraine has a right to self-defense. The UK, he added, had provided, quote, training and capability, a reference to weapons, to help Ukraine repel the Russian invasion, and said that he was visiting the US president partly because, quote, there are obviously further discussions to be had about the nature of that capability. And then later, Starmer was speaking on a plane to Washington, D.C. as he headed for a special foreign policy summit with Biden on Friday. The Prime Minister said he would not comment on Storm Shadow directly, but added he wanted to ensure that, quote, all his decisions or all the decisions we made are within the strategic contexts by discussing the issues with his US counterpart at the White House on Friday afternoon. Quote, there are really important developments likely in the next few weeks. So this is an interesting nugget, an interesting cryptic hint. There are really important developments likely in the next few weeks and months, but both in Ukraine and the Middle East, and therefore a number of tactical decisions ought to be taken, the Prime Minister said. David Lammy, Foreign Secretary, appeared to go one step further on Thursday night, saying Britain and the US should give Ukraine the weapons it needs to defeat Russia. Quote, this is a crucial period in the fight because you are setting things up to stop Russia getting the advantage over winter, he told the Daily Telegraph while visiting Kyiv. We are here also, of course, at a time when it is crystal clear that Russia is escalating with its friend Iran, taking a consignment of ballistic missiles that will be used in winter, sadly, against the Ukrainian people and which will cost lives. So, of course, we're here to strategize, to understand how we can put Ukrainians in a position to win and what is needed. I mean, that's really good rhetoric, nice and clear. I like it from David Lammy there, but also like it from Starmer. So this is good news, hopefully. Now, potentially, as a result of Starmer going over to the US to speak to Biden, and as a result of this desire from the UK to extend the range of Western weapons used in Russia by the Ukrainians, Russia has expelled 6 diplomats accused of spying. The FSB says the group attended NGO meetings. State TV Rossiya 24 published photos of the 6, naming them as Jessica Davenport, Callum Andrew Duff, Grace Elvin, Catherine McDonald, Blake Patel, Thomas John Hickson Stevenet. So there you go. We have potentially a reaction to that by the Russians. They would have been keeping this up their sleeves. This doesn't just happen, right? They'll be, right, we're going to get rid of these 6. The next issue there is, these 6 are going. So let's wait and see what that issue is. And then I think the Storm Shadow scenario has popped up and they've gone, right, let's get rid of these 6. And we are seeing potentially a political escalation, if not a military one. Gabrielis Landsbergis, who's a strong supporter of Ukraine. He's the foreign minister of Lithuania. He's arrived in Kyiv. Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia have all been thoroughly supportive of Ukraine, and increasingly so this week. All of them have been involved in really good rhetoric and delivering, or at least pledging, military and financial assistance to Ukraine. Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda said that Belarus poses ongoing risk to Europe and announced that Lithuania will call for stronger sanctions against Minsk, comparable to those imposed on Russia. He said this during a joint press conference with Ukrainian President Zelensky. So interesting that Belarus is potentially being drawn into further sanctions. Now, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has put another knife in Putin's back, says Nexter. Yesterday, Erdogan spoke at the fourth summit of the leaders of the Crimean platform. In his speech, he reiterated Turkey's position on the issue of Crimea and the war in Ukraine. So I reported this to you yesterday. Quote, our support for territorial integrity, sovereignty and independence of Ukraine is unwavering. The return to Crimea of Crimea to Ukraine is a requirement of international law. This is massive because Russia, arguably one of the main reasons they're involved in this war in Ukraine is, well, it started in 2014. They took Crimea. Crimea is the one major thing they want. There are other aspects of Ukraine, arguably natural resources from Donbass, lithium, hydrocarbons, all this kind of stuff, as well as just Ukraine as a whole. You could argue they want the agricultural capacity of Ukraine, since they are the breadbasket of the world, Russia to some degree, and Ukraine is one of the other breadbaskets of the world. And if Russia was to control the entire breadbasket of the world, then that's massive. And you could argue that was a major component of the reasons why they invaded. But Crimea, holding this Sevastopol, a deep sea warm water port that doesn't freeze over, that gives you access to the Mediterranean and therefore the Suez Canal down through to the east, and also the Mediterranean out to the Atlantic, the Black Sea, and Sevastopol, particularly with its deep sea warm water characteristics, which is great for a naval fleet, is insanely important. So Crimea is what it's all about. Now, Crimeans are where the Crimean Tatars live, and as I mentioned yesterday, there's that Islamic idea. Actually, somebody was saying in my threads that they are actually Crimean Tatars. That Tatar was a kind of pejorative used by Russians. That actually they're Crimean Turks. And that's why Erdogan is really strong on Crimea going back to Ukraine, or really thinking about what those Turks or Tatars want themselves, which is to go back to Ukraine. They're treated better by the Ukrainians than by the Russians. Russians, after the speech, began to count the number of knives in their back that the Turkish president had put in their backs. After all, says Nexter, the issue of Crimea is very painful for the Kremlin. They call Erdogan their ally, but is it true? Interesting, and there's a commentary here, but I won't go into it. But there are these connections to Turkey that are useful on behalf of Ukraine. This is I guess, a much appreciated statement by the Ukrainians from Erdogan. Although he speaks out both sides of his mouth, like militarily, he's more in support of Ukraine, although arguably economically and wanting to join BRICS, there is this desire to go in the other direction as well. Now, Polish Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski has suggested that support for Ukrainian refugees should be stopped immediately as it reduces Ukraine's mobilization potential. He emphasized that financial assistance to refugees could prevent young people from returning to defend their country, stating that disobedience should not be subsidized. This is interesting, possibly controversial. I know Bertold in my threads often talks about how these Ukrainians should be treated as refugees and should be accorded the same, a certain amount of, or the appropriate amount of rights, and etc., etc. But there's a whole thing to do with draft dodging and whether, I did a whole video on this. If you want to go and check out my draft dodging video, it talks about this and whether people are justified in evading as citizens a national draft just on account of it being dangerous to join the army. That's not enough to be able to claim refugee status. So it is interesting here. This is an ally saying that, look, we're willing, or at least I am as foreign minister, whether this is from a personal viewpoint or an official governmental viewpoint, I am willing, or we are willing to support getting Ukrainians back to Ukraine in order to fight and not subsidizing their existence here, with welfare state sort of refugee handout type thing. We're not going to subsidize them escaping from mobilization when, we're supporting militarily and financially, economically, we're supporting their country with X, Y, and Z, and they need to be there themselves doing that too. So interesting, lots of discussion to be had about that, but that's anyway what Sikorsky has said. Now, Shoigu, the defense minister for Ukraine, yes, he's still no, he's not. Belousov is the defense minister. Shoigu has moved aside to be more of an advisor to Putin, hasn't he? But anyway, sort of engaged with that kind of role still, I guess. Shoigu is visiting North Korea. Why? They recently went there. He's been there a number of times during the war, evidently to get consignments of military aid, and I presume he's going there again in order to get exactly that, more military aid. This is possibly a sign of the desperate straits that Russia are in, that they have to go cap in hand to Kim Jong-un time and time again. If they can't get any military aid, then maybe they can just take all the medals off this guy and smelt them down and turn them into missiles. It will be an award-winning missile, so who knows. Right, Russian companies are forced to use Chinese intermediaries, with more companies turning to them, given that the payment issues have not been resolved. It's not just refusals, but also increase in fees from entities like VTB Shanghai. So the idea here is, let's read on a little bit. The services of these intermediaries are not cheap. If the company is a big importer buying Chinese goods worth 200,000 to 300,000 US dollars a month, then the fees are manageable. But if the importer only purchases 20,000 to 30,000, the fee can be 8 to 10%. The commission of payment agents starts at 3%, but there could be increases when calculating the exchange rates with them. These payment agents are not the exchange rates of the Russian central bank, but of individual banks which are not as favorable. There are also a lot of scammers that pose as companies willing to help Russian businesses, so companies that seem to not be savvy enough end up with their money and without their money and their goods. Payment agents are Chinese individuals who can at some point just disappear. There's also the issue that funds can be frozen for months. The intermediary can have its accounts frozen after the transfer is received, then it will take a long time for payment agent to convince the bank that he has no connection to Russia and isn't sanction busting. There are ways to avoid this, but it's more expensive. The Russian company can open a letter of credit at the expense of the intermediary. He carries out their transaction at his own expense, and then the funds are sent over when the seller receives the money. Another way to avoid issues with frozen funds is for the intermediary to pledge property in case the amount of funds transferred are lost. Kyrgyzstan is also not an option, as it's blocked payments for goods that will not be received physically to Kyrgyzstan. So, point being, in order to evade sanctions and in order to evade Chinese banks not doing direct monetary transfers with Russia due to secondary sanctions from the US Treasury, there are all these other ways that Russia can get around the problem. But even though it's a bit like the ghost ships and buying widgets, and those widgets or widgets being made in the US or Germany, Poland, whatever, then going all around the world and then eventually ending up in Russia. All of these ways that Russia gets around sanctions, even if they succeed, it doesn't necessarily mean it's great for Russia. Like, it is bad. We'd rather they weren't able to do transactions at all, and we'd rather they weren't able to get hold of widgets at all. But the silver lining to that is when they do get hold of widgets and they do these transactions, it's freaking expensive, right? So if the widget is going from the US to here, to here, to here, inside the US, to all these different people, and then outside to Kyrgyzstan, and then here, and then eventually into Russia, everyone's taking their cut. So where it used to be, I'm making a widget and I'm selling it directly to Russia, you've got minimal costs involved. You've got all these people looking to make a profit or a cut off this eventual sale. That price is going to be far, far, far higher for the widget. Okay, so there's that. And when it comes to doing transactions here, or finding ways around doing direct transactions with China using all these intermediaries, it's incredibly risky, and you often lose out money and goods, or it's just insanely more expensive due to everyone taking cuts and non-preferable rates, and etc., etc. All of this will make it more expensive for Russia, and all of this will mean that they will get less bang for their buck. Literally bang for their buck. Pun unintended, but actually perfectly intended in retrospect. So Yeah, make of that what you will. Okay. As I mentioned earlier today, Australia wants to fine internet platforms up to 5% of their global revenue for failing to prevent the spread of so-called misinformation online. Yes, I agree with this. This isn't censorship. This is, you need to spread truth. And if you don't work harder to spread truth, we are going to fine you. You can still spread that disinformation, but it's going to cost you. And this is a form of moderation. This is a form of incentivization for people to start spreading truth. At the moment, the problem is people are incentivized to spread disinformation because of the rage and clickbait and etc. That actually there are financial incentives that effectively the free market moderates platforms to disinform. That is, and human psychology moderate, and all of these other aspects moderate content. They actually inform, or they incentivize platforms and people to spread falsity. And we need to do something about that. And this is about incentivizing them to spread truth. Legislation will be introduced in Parliament today. I find that interesting. Opposition, James Patterson said, Australians' legitimately held political beliefs should not be censored by either the government or by any foreign social media platforms. Yes, but then you can say exactly the same the other way around. Australians' illegitimately held political beliefs should not be incentivized by foreign social media platforms. I would suggest something needs to be done about that. And that looks a pretty sensible option to me. You need to look at the finer details. Right, Ukraine has the highest mortality rate in the world and the lowest birth rate. That's very bad for Ukraine, according to CIA statistics. The mortality rate is 18.6 per 1,000 people, the highest rate among all countries in the world. In terms of birth rate, Ukraine ranks last with 6 births per 1,000 people. Ouch. So they need to have more children and they need to have fewer people dying on the front lines or as civilians bombed in cities and so on and so forth. So that's a real challenge. That's going to be economically, like demographically, that's a huge challenge going forward. That's something that the Ukrainians will have to deal with. Russia's trying to deal with that by making sure people can't have abortions, making sure people have as many children as possible. And they're putting lots of things in place because they know that they're in a demographic sticky spot of bother, should we say. Right, I shared this with you yesterday as a whole separate breaking news update, and it freaked the crap out of me. JD Vance beats the Guinness Book of World Records for the most Kremlin talking points ever read in under 1 minute, says Jay in Kyiv. Here, a freeze of the current front line and Ukraine's refusal to join NATO may be proposed by Trump if elected as president, according to JD Vance, says Max24. And we come to some of these points. I'm going to read this out. I went to town on this yesterday, but I'm not going to read it out. Let's listen to JD Vance.
What are we there for? Man, it's a tough question. And I think some people have convinced themselves that this is like the great humanitarian mission of our time. And I think that's what drives some of it, even though I think it's fake and it's wrong. I think some people have convinced them
it's fake and it's wrong that it's a great humanitarian issue of our time. Literally, I think that, and that humanitarian issue is connected to it being a massive political, geopolitical, and military issue, and one of the great ones of our time. These things are all connected. It's fake. Is that fake? I mean, I believe that. Is my belief fake? No, it's my belief. So you can't call that fake. Is it wrong? Maybe wrong, but you would need to establish that. And I spent an awful long time establishing the opposite, my man. So stick that in your pipe and smoke it.
Themselves, this is like a war of good versus evil, right? Or Russia evil, Ukraine good. And once you get yourself in that fairy tale mindset.
So it's a fairy tale that Russia is evil and Ukraine is good when, 137,000 war crimes have now been registered that Russia has partaken in. Ukraine not so much. Is that fairy tale? Is that a fairy tale, matey?
You can justify a lot of stupid activity and a lot of stupid decisions. The truth is the Russians shouldn't have invaded, but the Ukrainians have got a lot of corruption problems too, right? It's a little bit.
Oh, that's okay. Sorry. The Russians shouldn't have invaded. Good. But they got a lot of corruption problems. Oh, victim blaming. Victim blaming. Well, you are female, so, you were asking for it. It's the judge, surely, female. She looked quite pretty. I mean, you have got a nice car. It's a nice car. Of course I'm going to steal it. I mean, I've seen him. Yeah, that guy over there. I think I saw him steal a loaf of bread from the shop. Anyway, I murdered him, so that's all right, though, isn't it?
A little bit more complicated than that.
You're damn bloody right it's more complicated than that.
The truth is the Russians shouldn't have invaded, but the Ukrainians have got a lot of corruption problems too, right? It's a little bit more complicated than that. And unfortunately...
But it's more complicated. But they are corrupt. But it's more complicated. But they are corrupt. But it's a bit more complicated than that.
You have no American leader who's willing to actually understand what's really going on over there. I mean, I think that some people, are going to get rich from that war. BlackRock and some of these major financial institutions talking about spending hundreds of billions of dollars on Ukrainian reconstruction. We know the stock prices of defense contractors have skyrocketed since the Ukraine.
It's like listening to RFK Jr. or some twit like that.
War started. So it's like a complicated mixture, right?
Anyway, that's what I didn't play yesterday. This is what I did play.
Wants this war to end. Ukraine wants this war to end. Europe, which, by the way, has underfunded this war while American taxpayers have been very generous to the Ukrainians.
Notice he said Europe has underfunded while American taxpayers are generous. So it's like Europe have not spent enough while Americans have spent enough. Let's just come back to that issue in a second.
Europeans want this war to end because it's jacking up their energy prices. So I think what this looks like is Trump sits down. He says to the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Europeans, you guys need to figure out what does a peaceful settlement look like. And what it probably looks like is something like the current line of demarcation between Russia and Ukraine. That becomes like a demilitarized zone. It's heavily fortified so the Russians don't invade again. Ukraine remains its independent sovereignty. Russia gets the guarantee of neutrality from Ukraine. It doesn't join NATO. It doesn't join, some of these sort of allied institutions. And I think that's ultimately what this looks like. And by the way, the Germans and other countries have to fund some Ukrainian reconstruction.
Right. I call that every single element of what he said there because it was egregious. I just want to clear up a few things because Andy S. has come along and said, and he's followed the channel for a long time, but he's quite a big fan of, say, Trump and doesn't like it, I think, when I have a go at someone like Vance. So he said, it's not empirically, so this is in answer to the things I'd said, it's not empirically incorrect. Europe has underfunded this war, not compared to the US, and American taxpayers have been generous. But my point was, he's making it's like his claim is the Trumpian claim. You've got to understand this in the context of Trump, who said that Europeans have paid $100 billion dollars less than the 150 billion less than the Americans, and they paid 200 billion or whatever. All those complete lies, essentially, or massive falsities that he has claimed. And then JD Vance comes out and says, well, Europe's underfunded the war and American taxpayers have been generous. And actually, I was saying that he's completely mischaracterizing what has been going on there. So Europe has actually funded the war much more than America, but than the US. And remember, this is a kind of boiling over the Cold War, you can argue. So this is US has a very prominent historical part to play causally in where we're at now. Not only is it part of their strategic objectives in terms of how they want the world to look, but it's also as a result of their previous strategic objectives since the Second World War. And that's where we're at. And so I just think Andy is being an apologist here for appeasement. He's right. It has jacked up the energy prices, and Europeans aren't happy with that. He didn't say it's the only thing. No, but he's saying it's about how you use inference. Like, you can be, technically there are other things, but he said no. They are worried about energy prices. Yeah, but that's not it. It's a lot more than that. He's just massively simplifying this to be problematically simplifying it, as if like Europeans are only worried about the war, rather than Polish people being worried about Russia coming through Ukraine and then ending up in Poland. How about the Baltic states? How about Finland? How about Sweden? And these are places, especially in the Nordic areas, that like Norway is energy independent. So this is such. He says it's a simplification. It's a complete bastardization, actually, and that's what he said in the other video, not in this second one. So again, and then he says the current line of demarcation that everyone recognizes, John. Nobody recognizes a new line but Russia. You say freezing current front lines, but he didn't say that. Yes, he did. He didn't use the term freeze, but everyone understands that as freeze, to the point where the tweet here says a freeze on a current front line, to the point where Ukrainska Pravda say Trump's plan for Ukraine involves a freeze on a front line and Kiev's refusal to join NATO, according to JD Vance. So that is free. He said keeping the front lines to exactly where they are now and becoming a NATO demilitarized zone. How do you understand it if it's not freezing? And so on and so forth. Joining NATO is going to take some time after this war. We still don't know what it's going to look like in 2 or 3 years' time. They can't join while they're still at war, or if Russia still retains some of Ukraine's land. NATO accession is still totally negotiable. Could be a message from Republicans to other parties like Putin or Ukraine or NATO that there's still work to be done before we can allow that. It's absolute. So he very clearly said, and we're going to have a demilitarized zone, and they won't be allowed to join NATO or other such organizations, which is not allowing them to join NATO. It's not they can't join NATO because they're still at war or there's contested territory. It's no, we're not going to allow them to join NATO. But that's a point of leverage. But that is what is stopping Russia from taking a second bite of the apple. It's hugely important that they're allowed to join NATO, so Article 5 can be invoked and thus stops Russia from invading again. Why do you think Russia hasn't invaded the Baltic nations? Because they got fricking Article 5 of NATO. That's why Russia has not gone into the Baltic nations. And Poland. Why Ukraine? Precisely because they weren't allowed to join NATO previously. So if they're not allowed to join it again, you are not stopping Russia from doing this again. It's just etc. etc. So I'm sorry, but this kind of apologia for JD Vance, I find it really, really problematic. And I think it's reading JD Vance's, even that last part, I'm not going to go into it, but it's reading JD Vance's words as charitably as you possibly can, and actually using, I think, problematic inference techniques with what he's saying. I can't read that like you're reading it, and you're wanting to read it because you really like him, but you'll be arguing that I'm reading it because I don't like him. I'm reading that because actually he's got an appeasement approach to Ukraine, which is morally and politically wrong. That's why it is just wrong, and I have no time for JD Vance saying that. And you've got to remember, this is in the context of just the day before Trump saying this.
When they took over, they got rid of it. We're in for 250 billion or more.
Wrong.
Because they don't ask Europe,
100
which
billion.
is a much bigger beneficiary to getting this thing done than we are. They're in for $150 billion less because...
So that's Europe paying only 50 billion, US paying 150 billion more, 200 billion. Whereas it's complete opposite. The US is in for 100 billion, and the EU, that's not even including UK, in for, I think one of the figures is 180 billion. So he's just got the figures entirely the wrong way around. JD Vance is repeating that lie by, I think, implication there.
Biden and you don't have the courage to ask Europe.
Steve, what's the...
So he's saying that the US are not asking Europe to do enough. So when JD Vance says that, the implication is that Europe aren't doing enough. And I just think it's really problematic. That last point about He says you've got Trump derangement syndrome. I know I've got an issue with Trump being morally egregious and politically naive and bad for the US and bad for the world. It's not Trump derangement syndrome. It would be the same if that was anyone else doing that. It's, Trump is just bad at what he does. He's very good at disinforming people and attracting you with talk about immigration. He is ideologically vacuous in many ways. He's an empty vessel, and what happens is he attracts you with dog whistle or big ideas that are devoid of any granular detail. So it's like, I'm going to send 10 million. I'm going to send 10 million illegal immigrants back, and I'm going to close the border, and I'm going to put tariffs on all Chinese goods. It doesn't tell you how he's going to do that, and doesn't give you the ramifications such as inflationary pressures that all of those things would have, etc., etc. But doesn't really tell you he's going to run the country in general. Like, what's his childcare plan? What's his education plan? What's his alternative to Obamacare? I've got concepts of plans. What happens is other people have these plans, and that's called Project 2025. And he's disavowed it, but it's what is there. So how the country gets run is he goes, big crazy things, and people go, yeah, that's what I want. And they say, I'm going to vote you in, and you get Trump in, and then under the covers, under the radar comes in Project 2025. That's how the country gets run. And that's scary crap there. And with that comes a complete appeasement approach to Ukraine. And it's incredibly, incredibly worrying. Don't get sold on vagueness and just talk about immigrants and how horrible immigrants are. Don't get sold on that, because you will find an awful lot of other horrible stuff happens underneath the radar. Julia Davis has been talking about the effect on the Russians Trump's debate had. Despite their disappointment, Putin's propagandists did find a bright spot for Moscow in a devastatingly disappointing debate. Trump's refusal to say that he wants Ukraine to win in its battle against Russia's invasion made them feel warm and fuzzy. There is a shock and dismay on Russian state TV since Moscow's true preferred candidate Donald Trump was no match for VP Kamala Harris. Putin's propagandists are eating crow, having walked into a trap of their own creation. Remember, she's written an article in a Daily Beast concerning that. Putin's pals bamboozled by complete fool, as complete fool creams our Donald. So what they called a complete fool, Kamala Harris, appears to have beaten Trump in debate, and they're not very happy about that. Now, how do Ukrainians feel about that? So there are these quotes from Russian propagandists, some of which I read to you yesterday. Now, the Kyiv Independent has got 5 prominent Ukrainian thinkers together and looked at their opinions. So Alexei Haran, who's a professor of comparative politics, says Trump was confused and it's not clear how he's going to address the war in Ukraine. On the other hand, Harris was more resolute as far as Ukraine was concerned. Volodymyr Dubovik, director of the Center of International Studies in Odessa National University, said, as for Trump, his refusal to say that he would like to see victory for Ukraine was somewhat shocking, even for experienced Trump watchers, but it's hardly surprising. Trump's view of Ukraine has been persistently negative for the last 8 years at least. Much of his view was shaped by people antagonistic to Ukraine, including Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who Trump praised last night. Support for Ukraine does not match Trump's transactional mindset. Quote, we help them, but what do we get in return? So nothing was surprising last night. Promises to end the war, but not being able to explain how. That was to be expected because, of course, there is no plan. But what is almost certain is that when Trump returns to the White House, he's going to apply pressure to Kyiv to concede to Russian demands. And then we just say, and now look at JD Vance. And that's exactly right. I mean, this is all coherence. Timothy Milovanov says, my position is very different from most others. When Trump was asked if it was in the US's interest for Ukraine to win, he avoided the question and said that it was in the US interest for the war to end. Alexander Merezhko, lawmaker and chair of the Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee, says, I view Trump's comments as election rhetoric, which should be treated with a grain of salt. His rhetoric is aimed at the part of his audience, his voters. He is trying to present himself as a politician who can easily reach any deal and who knows well both Zelensky and Putin. But if he's elected, he will have to face another kind of reality, which will be rather humbling. I don't think as of now he has any plan of peace for Ukraine. He will start seriously thinking about it only after he being elected, of course, if he is elected. As for Ukraine, we are in a rather vulnerable position because our survival depends on a great deal of American help. That is why we should be very careful now, because we don't know for sure who will become the next American president. In other words, let's not slag off Trump too much because he might end up being the president. And then Andrei Lyubika, writer and director of the Institute for Central European Strategy, said the key development of campaign intrigue to watch in the next 2 months is if Harris can change the accent from running an anti-Trump campaign, because right now she is developing her campaign on the fact that she is better than Trump, that Trump is evil. So the question is, will she be able to make people vote for her because she has a better platform, a better vision for the future, and not just because she's not Trump? And the main goal will be to deliver such a message to the key states. Will she be able to do it? I don't know, but her starting position is very good in my opinion. And as a Ukrainian, I wish her success. In other words, I don't want Trump to rule. So all of these people have a fairly these are Ukrainians, right? And who do an awful lot of thinking of this, have a fairly negative opinion of Trump winning the election and what that would entail for Ukraine. So, for Trump supporters like Andy S., I respect you for being pro-Ukraine, but I just don't know how you square that issue of being pro-Trump and still being pro-Ukraine without saying, look, I like Trump for other reasons, he's just going to suck for Ukraine. And although I support Ukraine, I do admit he will suck for Ukraine. I would give you much more respect for being like that, because I think that's more of the truth, rather than saying, I love Trump and he'll be great for Ukraine. Yeah, but what about everything he's ever said? Yeah, but if you read it like this and read it like that, it's no, but actually his words and the words of his children and the words of his advisors and the words of the politicians around him and the words of the people advising him for his debate, like Tulsi Gabbard and Matt Gaetz, and his biggest supporters, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Jim Jordan, Paul Gosar. What about their opinions? Well, what about Steve Bannon? What about Stephen Miller? What about your man in charge of Heritage Foundation, and Heritage Foundation supporting not supporting Ukraine and providing Project 2025 on your behalf? What about all of these? Because none of this looks to be supportive of Ukraine. All of this looks to be a case of appeasement of Russia. So you can say what you like about Trump, but 100% of the people around him at the moment appear to be very anti-Ukraine. That is a massive, massive challenge. And Adam Kinzinger just says it much more eloquently and pithily than I do. Honestly, if you care about Ukraine and that issue is important, Trump would be a disaster. As someone else says, if you vote for Trump, you're plunging your own personal knife into Ukraine's back. You aren't a fella. You never were. So Adam Kinzinger, former Republican there. And in fact, we've got former Republicans here in the Bulwark, the deepest difference between Trump and Harris. So this is a really interesting article. One question in the debate revealed the candidates' diverging visions of America and the role in the world. It goes on to say here, it's clear that in the 2.5 years since, Trump's moral compass has not righted itself. It was a simple question for a would-be president. Does he want our democratic ally, which has been brutalized, to win its war of self-defense? He could not say yes, and what's more, he instantly turned to where his heart truly lies, with money. Even if it were true that the United States had paid the lion's share of Ukraine's defense, that would be a point of pride. It's a really interesting way of framing that. So what if we paid more? It means more to us, both morally and strategically, that Ukraine prevail. We have paid more. Yeah, deal with it. It's part of our governmental strategy. But no, it's like, it's all about money. They paid more than us. Real transactional, real zero-sum game. But then it goes on to say, but it isn't true. This is Sam Steiner thing. Europe has contributed much more when financial and humanitarian contributions are included. Trump misstated the relative contributions of NATO members to Ukraine's defense. As a percentage of GDP, the United States contribution ranked behind 16 other countries. It was 31. They were 31st as a percentage of GDP, and before the $61 billion came, and now they're 16th, 17th. So. More ominously, Trump showed again that he has a cash register where his soul should be. That is one of the greatest sentences concerning Trump that I have ever heard. If you were to sum up Trump in one sentence, that does it for me. Trump showed again that he has a cash register where his soul should be. which is brilliant. What followed also provided a glimpse into Trump's essential smallness. After Harris's bold declaration of solidarity with Ukraine, he says later, and NATO and her contempt for Trump's truckling to dictators, Trump responded with timid bleats about Putin's nuclear arsenal. So this was the, you're going to eat you for lunch, and the whole kind of, we've given javelins and Abrams, and, we should be proud of that. Trump said, but eventually, he's got a thing that other people don't have. He's got nuclear weapons. They don't ever talk about that. He's got nuclear weapons. Nobody ever thinks about that. I mean, that's the entire Jake Sullivan anti-escalation approach, but apparently nobody ever thinks about that. And eventually maybe he'll use them. So Trump is basically aligning himself with the Biden administration in the form of Jake Sullivan here. Maybe he hasn't been that threatening, but he does have that, something we don't even like to talk about. Nobody likes to talk about it. You know who does like to talk about it all the time, says Stein? Putin. He has threatened to use his nuclear arsenal on countless occasions. When he invaded Ukraine in 2022, he warned that whoever tries to hinder us or threaten our country or our people should know that Russia's response will be immediate and will lead you to the consequences that you have never faced in your history. He said that in 2022, and all of that escalation that's taken place since then, nothing has happened. Later that year, he thundered that, quote, if the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we will without doubt use all available means to protect Russia and our people. This is not a bluff. He referenced the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, saying that the United States had established a precedent. What happened since then? Nothing. This is an empty rhetoric. Cooler heads than Trump's see Putin's threats for what they are, bluster. Obviously, one cannot dismiss his arsenal out of hand, but neither should we, the world, cower in the face of one empty threat after another. Ukraine is at this moment holding territory it seized from Russia and flying drones into Moscow and beyond. Putin found Zelensky impossible to intimidate. Not so Donald Trump. Absolutely brilliant article there. It really is. Sorry, it's not Sam Stein. It's Mona Charen. I do apologise. Mona Charen there writing that. So the Bulwark, which is like a Republican network or a conservative network that is kind of Reagan republicanism, really finding issues with Trump at the moment with regard to Ukraine. In fact, The Guardian came out with an article concerning Andrew McCabe, saying that Donald Trump is a de facto Russian asset, and he's a former FBI head. So Donald Trump can be seen as a Russian asset, though not in the traditional sense of an active agent or a recruited source, an ex-FBI deputy director under the former US president. So a former employee in the Trump administration, effectively. Asked on a podcast if he thought it possible Trump was a Russian asset, Andrew McCabe, who Trump fired as the FBI deputy director in 2018, said, I do. He added, I don't know that I would characterize it as an active, recruited and knowing asset in a way that people in the intelligence community think of that term. But I do think that Trump has given us many reasons to question his approach to the Russia problem in the US. And I think his approach to interacting with Putin, be it phone calls, face-to-face meetings, the things that he has said in public about Putin, all raise significant questions. McCabe was speaking on a One Decision podcast co-hosted by Sir Richard Dearlove, a former head of MI6, the British intelligence service. The conversation in which McCabe also questioned Trump's attitude to supporting Ukraine and NATO in the face of Russian aggression was recorded before the debate in Philadelphia on Tuesday, in which Trump was made more controversial comments. Claiming Russia would not have invaded Ukraine had he been president, Trump would not say a Ukrainian victory was in US interests. I think it's in the US best interest to get this war finished and just get it done, negotiate a deal, said Trump. Claiming to have good relationship with Putin and Zelensky, the Ukrainian president Trump falsely said his opponent, Harris, failed to avert war through personal talks. Vice President countered that she had helped preserve the ability of Zelensky and the Ukrainians to fight for their independence. Otherwise, Putin would be sitting in Kiev with his eyes on the rest of Europe, starting with Poland, so on and so forth. Now, speaking on this podcast, McCabe said, you have to have some very serious questions about why it is that Donald Trump has this fawning sort of admiration for Putin in a way that no other American president, Republican or Democrat, ever has. It may just be from fundamental misunderstanding of this problem that's always a problem. That's always a possibility. And I guess the other end of that spectrum would be that there's some kind of relationship or a desire for a relationship of some sort, be it economic or business oriented, what have you. I think those are possibilities. None of them have been proven, but as an intelligence officer, those are the things that you'd think about. Saying he had very serious concerns about the prospect of a second Trump term. McCabe said he would always be concerned with Russia's ability to interfere in US affairs. He said their desire to kind of wreak havoc or mischief in our political system is something that's been going on for years, decades and decades and decades. They're interested in just simply sowing chaos and division and polarization. If they can do that, it's a win. If they can actually hurt a candidate they don't like or help one that they do like, that's an even bigger win, said McCabe. And then you've got the opinion here from the Kyiv Independent. So coming from Ukraine, they write that Harris will be more aggressive than Biden in supporting Ukraine. And that's Ukraine, according to ex-US ambassador. So Democratic candidate and US Vice President Harris will be, quote, more aggressive in supporting Ukraine than US President Joe Biden if she wins the November election, according to Williams B. Taylor, the former ambassador to Ukraine. Quote, she will have the ability to be even stronger if she wants to, and my bet is she's going to be a little more aggressive than Biden, Taylor said at a meeting at the American University Kiev, attended by the Kyiv Independent. Yes, he was slow to make some decisions about HIMARS, Abrams and F-16s, that's Biden, and now he is slow to make decisions about attacking deep into Russia. But if she's elected, Harris, she will have a new Secretary of State, probably a new National Security Advisor. She has the opportunity to bring in people who are even more supportive of Ukraine or not. My bet is they will be more supportive. So the opinion of someone that's somewhat in the know is that Harris will be harder on Russia, better supporter of Ukraine than the present Biden administration. Right, the Kyiv Independent says Harris allies to run ads highlighting Ukraine support in key battleground states, according to Politico. Democrat leading America's Future Majority Fund, Super PAC, Political Action Committee, unveiled new adverts highlighting VP Kamala Harris's record on Ukraine while criticizing former President Donald Trump's comments on the NATO alliance. The TV and digital ads, which will be run in battleground swing states, Pennsylvania, Michigan and Wisconsin, are expected to target Eastern European American voters, including the sizable Polish, Lithuanian and Ukrainian diasporas, according to Politico on the 12th. That's fascinating, that, because I have wondered about this, whether it's too much of a divisive subject. You want to keep it like low down, not talk about Ukraine too much because it's divisiveness, but actually they might be going hard trying to attract the vote of those European Americans. Okay, we are just finally we're going to talk about Russian interference on US election, as we've seen with, say, tenant media and other potential areas too. This is what's his name? It is it's not Jory Craig, so she's interested. Yeah, it's Stuart Stevens, a political consultant.
They are playing and why in this election.
Thanks. It's a real honor to be here. You know, by context, there was a whole generation of us who were drawn to the Republican Party by Ronald Reagan standing in front of the Berlin Wall, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And the beating heart of the anti-Soviet Union, stand up to communism element of American politics was the most conservative part of the Republican Party. Cut to today. The pro-Putin element of American politics is the most conservative element of the Republican Party. I don't think we've ever seen anything like this. This would be sort of like Churchill's party becomes the not just German, but Nazi party. So,
now, I'm going to interrupt him. So I know a bunch of you might still, if you're still watching this and you're Republican and you see me, I'm not attacking you, I'm attacking Trump and that kind of MAGA Republicanism. What he's tapping into is a well-known, empirically defensible position that elements of the Republican Party have been over time becoming more and more enamored with Putin himself as well as Russia. So there are two different things. There's some polls showing that actually a lot of conservatives were rated Putin much more strongly than they rated Russia, because they see him as not only a strong leader but standing up for Christian evangelical traditional moral norms and mores. So here's an article in the New Republic, the Republicans who sold their souls to Vladimir Putin. I mean, it's a huge article, really interesting stuff. But the trope of Putin as the anti-Obama began with Trump. By the time Palin and Hannity made the aforementioned remarks, Trump had already said that Putin has no respect for Obama, and that Putin is laughing at Obama, and that Putin is much smarter than Obama, and that Putin is having such a good time. Obama is making him look like the genius of geniuses. As with all things in the Obama to Trump whiplash, there's a strong cultural vein in the shift that slowly began to ensue, where Putin went from being the sort of figure that the resident of the White House needed to be capable of pushing around to a figure of admiration in his own right, eventually leading to something akin to into a right-wing fandom. After Russia passed a monumental and widely condemned anti-gay law in 2013, one Daily Caller editorialist, so the Daily Caller is a very right-wing media source, praised the country for resisting the political movement to regularize and even celebrate homosexuality, adding that many Russians, quote, are appalled, as are many Americans, at how these sexual practices and lifestyles are celebrated in the United States. It's worth noting that at the time that the column appeared, gay marriage was still illegal in the US. While much of Vladimir Putin's public image, the Ubermensch who rides horses shirtless and baptizes himself in icy lakes, is a collage of Kremlin propaganda, it's clear that Putin understands the wedges that divide America, and he has leaned into this role as an outside crusader in the ongoing American culture war. Professor Angela Trent, author of Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest, says, quote, I think that what Putin's doing right now is watching very carefully. It was clear in the interview with Tucker Carlson that he was aware of a lot of these trends. So on and so forth. Huge, really good article looking at the attraction to Republican conservatives, particularly of religious persuasion, the attraction of Putin and Putin's Russia. So this is back in January 2022. So this is just before the war started. Poll, as Ukraine tensions escalate, 62% of Republicans say Putin is a stronger leader than Biden. This is then going forward to April 2023. Putin's popularity, so this war's been going on for a year and a bit. Putin's popularity reaches record high in the US, according to a poll. So the Kremlin leader's popularity among Americans as of the first quarter of 2023 stands at 21%, according to polls to YouGov. And there's a massive disparity there between the two political domains, like the Democrats and the Republicans. But yeah, it's just really fascinating. Then you've got an interesting piece in ABC. Why do so many of America's white evangelicals support Putin? And that was April 2022, just after the war started. And I've done a video segment on this. I might have done a whole video talking about the connection, the religious connection of American conservatives to Russia, and how it undergirds a lot of their support of Putin, and why you get this interesting MAGA Republican desire to see a Russian appeasement and being anti-Ukraine and pro-Russia. And a Politico article from 2016, but this is, in other words, this has been going on, this is 8 years old. And there was an article in the New Humanist in 2017 that was absolutely phenomenal, looking at how Putin was manipulating both nationalist thought in Russia by appealing to conservatives through religious fundamentalism in 2017, that was, and actually that was backdating the actions he had done in terms of some of the laws and getting into bed with the Russian Orthodox Church, and how that then has an appeal to certain people in the US, and I wrote an article on that way back when, I think. Here, this 2016 Politico article, more Republicans viewing Putin favourably. So my point of this, and you can go and look at all these articles. The Bond that explains why some on the Christian right support Putin. American evangelicals divide over Ukraine. That's Christianity Today reporting that, admitting that, there is this divide over Ukraine. Why white evangelical Christians are Putin's biggest American I don't know what the rest of that title is. Biggest American asset. Christian nationalists support Putin even if they oppose Russia. And that's the idea that there's often a difference between support for Putin even if they don't support Russia as a whole. Can the Christian right quit Putin at Slate magazine? And so on and so forth. There's so many fascinating articles on this topic. I'm not pulling this out of my arse. And nor is Stuart Stevens here.
So how did this happen? I think one of the discussed aspects of this is how much American conservatives admire Russia. And they look at Russia and they see this as a country in which there's only white men in charge. There are no gays in Russia, as Putin says. They see them all as this myth that they're all Christians. So you think Putin's a Christian, you're insane. Secondly, has a huge Muslim population and non-Christian population. They see it where elections are performative, but not decisive. And they like that. And we shouldn't underestimate that. In all the presidential campaigns, I worked in 5 of them, there was always a lawyer, usually in our case it was Ben Ginsburg, who would stand up and would tell people the rules of the road, one of which most striking would be if you're contacted by anyone from foreign, an adversary, or even an ally, you should immediately let us, the lawyers, know, and we will immediately, if appropriate, go to the FBI. I mean, it's just incredible to think that going back to 16, there was over 100 contacts between the Trump campaign and Russians. And bringing in Paul Manafort. I mean, Paul, I've known forever, right? I mean, Paul was a pirate. He was out there under the Jolly Roger. He would have taken offense if you had said, like, this is someone who's really operating in an ethical way. He would go, wait, come on, buddy. And he was in that cesspool of oligarch money that was all over Eastern Europe. And he tried to bring a lot of people into it, tried to get my firm to work in those elections.
So Stevens here has a personal connection to Paul Manafort, saying this is exactly who he is. As I keep telling you guys, watch Active Measures on Amazon Prime or wherever you can find it. It will detail exactly how compromised the 2016 campaign was with regard to people like Paul Manafort and the Russians.
Offered us millions of dollars. So there was no pretense that when Trump brought in Manafort, he was bringing in a Russian agent.
Which he's done again.
What did they
He's
do?
doing that now.
And they changed the platform to be more pro-Russian, less support for Ukraine. And I think that we have to look at this as the most successful covert operation in history, probably, certainly modern history. So what did they get? Putin supported Trump. Trump won. What did he get? Vastly more than they could have ever imagined. They got not just an individual here or there, they got a party. So now the Republican Party, to a large degree, its foreign policy is pro-Putin and standing up with Viktor Orban. I mean, think about that. Of all the Western leaders to say you were admired by, to pick Viktor Orban as Trump did last night. And yes, there still is this other element, Lindsey Graham and these people, but they're being completely compromised by the fact that they are supporting Trump. And you can't do both of those. You can't say that you're pro-American, you want to stand up to Putin and support the candidate who, even before he's elected, as he says, will surrender Ukraine to Russia. And
this is why you've got Adam Kinzinger. This is why you've got Liz Cheney. This is why you've got 200 Republicans have come out of the Republican Party and said, we cannot endorse Trump. We just can't do it. There's no way I can justify that with my moral and political compass as it is. And so therefore, the only other option is to endorse Kamala Harris.
Story here about money. And we've never gotten properly exposed the degree to which Russian money went into the NRA. And there were vast
National Rifle
sums
Association
of money that went into the NRA. And there was this scandal with this woman who was named as a spy and all of this.
The Justice Department announced the arrest of a Russian woman on charges that she conspired to act as an agent of Moscow to influence American politics.
Despite a ton of reporting on Russia and Maria Butina and the Russian efforts to infiltrate and influence the NRA, we never ultimately heard of what became of that reported FBI investigation into whether part of what was going on with the NRA is that Russia was using the group to funnel foreign money into the 2016 election to help Trump.
But trust me, this went much deeper. So think about that. That's one of the key constituent elements of the Republican Party, which was compromised by Russian money. And it goes just a lot deeper than people realize. And I think that it's extraordinarily dangerous for the country. And hopefully now it's being exposed.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally would agree. And I'm being partisan, but actually I'm deeply worried. I'm deeply worried by the influence that Russia has in every single country in the world, not just the US, all over Europe, in the UK, everywhere. But I think to be able to influence the most powerful country in the world, the US, in the way that it apparently has, is deeply, deeply concerning. And I think this election is much more than Democrats against Republicans. This is about the future of the US in terms of, being its own properly sovereign nation. Honestly, it's that serious, this election. Like if you vote for Trump's Republican Party, you are voting to condone Russian interference in the US, financially, economically, ideologically, geopolitically, militarily, essentially. Like this is a deeply, deeply worrying moment of time, and there's a decision to be made in November. And I hope to goodness the right decision is made. That's why I've belabored this point, and this video has gone on for as long as it has, because I think it's that important to talk about this. I know I'm going to upset a lot of Republicans, but I wouldn't have it any other way. Not trying to upset people, but trying to make people recognize how freaking important this is, how much of a threat Russia are to us all.